Hello, everyone. Today we will discuss the section titled Interpreting GDP. Now, we will first define what gross domestic product or GDP is. So dividing GDP by the size of the country's population is going to give us the gross domestic product per capita. So whatever the national income is, we are dividing it with the number of people in the country, and that gives us the average. So the average income we define as the GDP per capita. And this is widely used as a measure of average standard of living in a country. And if we look at what nominal GDP, so gross domestic product, is, here we have the definition of nominal GDP. This applies to any country you can imagine. And the way we define this in, of course, market economies particularly, is a summation from I from 1 to n for each price of the good I and quantity sold for good I, right? So what we are doing here is the prices are multiplying quantities, and this is done from the first good to the nth good. This could be 10 goods, 50 goods and services. So all the goods and services supplied in the market are just multiplied one by one for their prices, the quantity sold, and adding those up. So that's what the sigma sign does. Adding those individual multiplications, we end up obtaining the nominal GDP. So here, PI again is the price of good I, QI is the quantity of good sold, the ith good, and sigma indicates the summation of these price time quantities for all the goods and services. So as you can imagine, if you were to pick each and every single goods and service provided in the market and multiply them with their corresponding prices, add them up, you end up obtaining the total economic activity, at least a measure of total economic activity in a country. And GDP per capita needs to be kept in mind. It's the average income in the country, but it's not a perfect measure of standard of living. First and foremost, it does not include many important aspects of our well-being, including leisure time and quality of our physical and environmental or social environment. And it does not equally, or it does not consider the distribution of income. So what you need to keep in mind here is that you can produce larger and larger amounts, and to do so, you need to work more and more. And of course, people care about leisure as much as what they are able to consume, so what they produce. So one may need to keep in mind a high GDP does not necessarily say that people are able to enjoy free time as well. And similarly, it does not necessarily say something about the physical and social environment. So this could come together with lots of emissions and other environmental troubles, depending on, of course, how you produce what you produce. And lastly, GDP per capita is the average income. So some people may be earning much more than this average, while some are earning much less than this average. So it doesn't necessarily say something about how frequently we observe people earning the average income, but it still gives us an approximate sense of the overall economic performance in the economy. Particularly, you could have a large gross domestic product, all thanks to a large population, all working people. But when you consider the large population, so per person, how much you're able to produce, gross domestic product per capita informs you about that. And provided that we keep these limitations in mind, it can still be useful, is what we're trying to say. And comparing output of one country at two different points in time, it will become necessary to take into account that the prices are going to be different in two points in time. So as we can see from the definition of GDP, if I go back to the slides, this is applying to the price of the goods and services I and quantity of the ith good or service multiplied at a given time. And notice, as we can produce more and more from year to year, the prices of these goods are also going to change from year to year. So one may need to keep in mind the price differences from year to year when they compare GDP from one year to another. Also, if you want to compare different countries' gross domestic product from one year to another, we may also need to keep in mind that different countries will have different prices. Now, to account for that, at least for a given country, we have what we call the real GDP. So to obtain the real GDP, the first step is estimating the or obtaining the nominal GDP, right? So you start with your nominal GDP, that is given year, given prices, given output sold. You obtain the nominal GDP by multiplying these amounts and summing them up. And after that, we track what is happening to real GDP by picking a base year. This will become relevant just in a second, but this will just to say that the prices in this example of, let's say, 2020 are going to be our comparison year. So we're going to compare the prices of the years following 2020 to 2020. So we define the real GDP using 2020 prices as equal to nominal GDP. This should make sense because if we are basing our analysis here to the year 2020, well, the 2020 prices are equal to 2020 prices. So the nominal GDP that year is going to be equal to the real GDP. The quantity is the same, the prices are the same. So we have the same GDP measured in real terms or nominal terms for the same year. But the following year, nominal GDP 2021 is again calculated. And to do so, what you do, you multiply the prices with quantities of goods and services, you add those up. But notice you may have more production done from 2020, but the prices may also have changed. It's very likely, in fact, the prices are going to change. So to be able to make that comparison for calculating the real GDP of 2021, what we do is we use the prices of 2020 and quantities of 2021. So there will be typically different quantities for one year to another, and that's what we want to measure, right? So we want to see how much the economy was able to produce more or less. And if we were to use nominal GDP, we would observe the effect of the increase in production, but also changes in prices. To avoid that, we pick, again, a base year. In this example, we pick 2020. We observe the real GDP and nominal GDP of 2020, and then we observe the nominal GDP of 2021. And to calculate the real GDP of 2021, we use the prices of 2020 for the quantities of 2021. And then we compare these changes. So, when you want to use real and when you want to use the nominal measures, so you use data in current prices, that is nominal GDP, when calculating shares of GDP or ratios to GDP. And otherwise, you can use real GDP. So when we speak of things like consumption share in gross domestic product, investment share in gross domestic product, and some other measures, we can use nominal GDP. But for real GDP, so gauge the size and growth of the economy, assessing GDP per capita, and make cross-country comparisons, you need to keep in mind that the prices are going to reflect their impacts in these comparisons. So you may want to use a real measure as opposed to the nominal measure. Another measure that we may want to keep in mind making different comparisons between different countries is what we call purchasing power parity, so PPP. And this is to compare GDP per capita across countries, and we need to choose a set of prices and apply it to both countries. So, your textbook gives an example here. So you can consider two countries at very different levels of development. So Sweden and Indonesia can be an example. And because prices are so much lower in Indonesia than in Sweden, to maintain the same standard of living in their respective capital cities, Jakarta and Stockholm, you would need apparently $2,455 per month in Jakarta as compared to almost $5,000 in Stockholm. And comparisons between the value of output in two countries are generally performed by converting the value of GDP of each country into United States dollars and then comparing them. So, United States dollars is a very commonly used currency. So we can compare the Jakarta or more importantly, Indonesia gross domestic product to United States dollars from the Indonesian currency. And we do the same to Sweden and compare the gross domestic product of these countries in United States dollars terms. So this conversion to dollars can be done either using market exchange rates. So whatever exchange rate is traded at that very moment for Swedish currencies to United States dollars or Indonesian currencies to United States dollars. Another way is purchasing power parity exchange rate. So the rate at which the currency of one country would have to be converted into that of another to purchase the same amount of goods and services in each country. So you can see this is not as easy because you need to come up with the same basket in or comparable baskets of goods and services in different countries. And then you compare the total prices of these baskets in different countries to come up with a conclusion on what the purchasing power parity is. As we said, there are some issues with gross domestic product as a measure of the overall economic performance. So challenges related to changes in the quality of goods is something to keep in mind because the country may be growing in terms of how much it's producing, goods and services, but that doesn't necessarily inform us about the quality of these goods and services. It's just the quantity that we're informed about. And gross domestic product will not include non-market activities such as household and volunteer work. And notice what's mentioned here by household work is the type of work that we do without getting paid, right? So elderly care, child care, cleaning your house, and all care activities that are done within household without pay. None of these are captured in gross domestic product, although they are work. And ultimately, we also don't count the underground or illegal economy. So this varies from country to country, of course, but none of this is necessarily reported to national accounts. And therefore, we don't have a measure of the size of this part of the economic activity. And there are also issues which limit the usefulness of GDP per capita as a measure of living standards. One of these is production, which increases GDP but leads to depletion of natural resources. So we may have, the negative impacts of the increase in gross domestic product not necessarily captured in the definition of gross domestic product. How do we define the growth rate of GDP if we accept it as a measure, a reliable measure of the overall economic activity? So the fluctuations in economic activity are typical in most market economies, capitalist economies, and to assess how GDP changes from period to period, we calculate its growth rate, that is the percentage change. So what we do here is we look at the gross domestic product here in 2023 and subtract the 2022 from that and divide by 2022 to obtain percentage points. We multiply with 100. So this is the percentage change in the real GDP obtained by using real GDP of 2023 and 2022. Well, this may be observed in some time series as well. We will learn now how to read certain figures. Here we have the real GDP for United Kingdom and Japan. And here in the x-axis, we have the years. It's from 1875. So one reason these countries are picked because they have data for quite some time, almost early 1900s. And you see this almost exponential growth. But you can also see ups and downs in both United Kingdom and Japan to some extent, particularly later years, you're able to see these variations more. That is, although there's an overall upwards trend in the economic growth or the total national income measured in real terms for both of these countries, we also see from time to time some recessions presenting themselves. Now, I want you to focus here on the y-axis, right? So we see from zero, no income, to 400,000 pounds, and then 800,000, then 1,200,000. So the increase is here linear in the sense that it's adding up 400,000 at each step. And for Japan, that's 40,000, 40,000, 40,000, 40,000, right? So it's a linear scale here. We can present same data here for the figures below, United Kingdom again, Japan again, but this time the Y scale, so remember the X scale still is or X-axis here is still the time for years, but the Y-axis, the scale here is logarithmic, or we can call this a ratio scale in this example. You start from 100,000 and then doubles to 200,000 and from 200,000 to 400,000, right? So you notice this number here on the y-axis is doubling down in each step. Here it was increasing linearly, so we were adding up 400,000, and here we are multiplying with 2. The same applies to Japan. You see here from 2,000 to 4,000, 4,000 to 8,000, 8,000 to 16,000. Notice this data for United Kingdom and Japan And the data presented below are the same variables, same measures, and same everything. It's just presented differently to emphasize or exaggerate, if you will, these cycles that you see on the figures above, right? So in the first row here, we do see some ups and downs in economic activity, but in the scale of everything, it's somewhat harder to see, particularly in early years, how much variation there is. This almost looks linear, as you can see. In fact, in Japan's case, it's very hard to notice any variation in most parts of the early parts of data. However, you could go here to the figures below. In the ratio scales, you can see the variations much clearly. And despite the fact that we have an upward sloping curve here, so very clear upwards trend, if you will, we're not necessarily able to observe the variations in the first row as well as here. So we can see the impacts of the recessions, upswings and downswings much clearer here. And also for Japan's case, the stagnation, if you will, that follows from 1980s onwards is documented much clearly here. So you see if Japanese economy were to sustain the same growth rate it sustained until 1980, it would have been maybe around 300,000 level at this point, but it isn't, right? So we are seeing a stagnation in post-1980s onwards economic activity. This also tells us something very useful for articulating the growth performance of a country. If you might want to call that a rule of thumb. So this is going to tell us how long is it going to take for a country to double its GDP, right? So if the economy is growing at a constant rate, this is a crucial assumption for this rule to work. The number of years it takes or it will take for the real GDP to double is approximately 70 divided by the annual growth rate. So number of years for real GDP to double is 70 divided by the annual growth rate. So if the country is growing by 2%, you divide 70 by 2% to obtain how many years it's going to take for the country's GDP to double. So we refer to this approximation as the 70 rule. And we can see this applies to some extent with the use of this linearization or the ratio rule. You can do this as an exercise. So calculate the years it passed for the country's income to double, and you will see there's some truth to this rule of thumb in at least certain countries. Now we talked about so far the measure of GDP and how good it is and what it does, and we have also observed there are ups and downs in the overall economic activity. Now this we define as the business cycle. And there are two definitions of recessions that appear in these cycles. The first one is the MBER's definition, and this is very straightforward. It is a declining output. And a recession is over once the economy begins to grow again. So as long as the growth rate is not negative, you're not in a recession in this definition. And the alternative definition is the level of output is below its normal level. And even if the economy is growing, a recession is said to be not over until output has grown enough to get back to this normal level. So this requires you to know a normal level, of course. This requires some estimations, but it also says you're not necessarily in a recession, based on the MBER definition. So these may give different outcomes, although for the most part, they will be corresponding or they will be identifying recessions in the same way. And the movement from boom to recession and back to boom is known the business cycle. So the economy is growing and then going down, economic activity, and those ups and downs we call the business cycle, or we define them as the business cycle. So here we have that for the United Kingdom again, and you see in the y-axis the GDP growth rate. So here we have 0. Anything below is a recession because the economy is contracting, it's getting smaller, and anything above is growth, it's a boom. And you can see the boom bust cycle clearly here in the sense that the positives are followed by a decline and then some negatives, positive growth rates, negative growth rates, positive growth rates, negative growth rates. So you can see clearly that the economic activity grows and goes down and grows and goes down quite very often in the even developed capitalist nations. And there's a corresponding unemployment story, of course, right? So you can see here around the First World War, the English unemployment was declining sharply. And then after the First World War, we are seeing the economic activity collapsing. We see something like a 10% contraction, followed by a sharp increase in unemployment. Similarly, here we have another recession around the start of the Great Depression, and a very sharp increase in unemployment following that. We see the business cycle peak and cycle through here. So if you compare, for example, 2007, so here we have the 2008 financial crisis, the economic activity again goes down considerably, and followed by an increase in unemployment all the way up to 8%. So and here the pandemic's economic impact as a decline in economic activity is clearly seen, although the unemployment showed a different impact in the English economy, apparently. So this is just to say the gross domestic product is not always increasing, and we do see regular, in fact, ups and downs in economic activity measured by the GDP. Now, what drives these fluctuations, right? So we want to know, of course, we would like to live in a world in which we are not seeing sharp declines in economic activity that are followed by unemployment. No one wants to lose their job. No one wants to lose their ability to make a living. And we would like to know what are the contributing factors to these ups and downs. And as a start to finding this answer, we can examine how each of the expenditure components of GDP contributes to the growth and decline to begin with. And to define that, we will look into the percentage change in gross domestic product. So this total change in GDP is going to be decomposed into the change in consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, which is exports minus imports. Well, keep in mind, this is going to be the percentage change in consumption times the share of consumption in GDP, right? So the change times how much it contributes to begin with to the as a share to GDP. And we will do the same to investments, government spending, and net exports. And this summation should give us the total percentage change in GDP, but it should also inform us about the individual parts, how much they contribute into the variation of gross domestic product. Now, this will become a relevant measure. Here we have, again, data for United States. So the share of GDP in 2009, of course, GDP divided by GDP is 100. Consumption is around 70% of the total GDP in the United States in 2009. And investment is something around, 18%, less than that. It's fair to say 17%. And government spending, again, is around 17% of the total economic activity. So if you look at the net exports, it's again negligible, it's small, 2%. It's negative. That is just to say United States was importing more than it's exporting, because keep in mind net exports is X minus M. This is negative when M is larger than X. So we have a negative net exports here. And then we look at the contribution to the change in GDP. And there was a decline in economic activity, apparently. And we see the consumption's contribution is something around 1%, but the investment's contribution is 3.5%. And we see the government expenditure, contributing 0.64%, so less than 1%, and net exports a bit more than 1%. What really stands out here is how little investment contributes to the share of GDP, although when it comes to the contribution to the change in real GDP, real investments or investments are a major part, right? So you see 3.5 larger than the overall change already, and the consumption's change is again less than the investments contribution to the total change. Government expenditure and exports, the absolute value or the magnitude of investments is above virtually all one of them. So this informs us about something very important, that investments have an important characteristic, not unique to the United States, when it comes to capturing these variations in economic activity. So a close examination of these charts for the rich countries also show that the consumption is less volatile than gross domestic product. So here we have the United Kingdom and United States, and here we have the green line here. So I'll try to track it for everyone. So you can see here the change in consumption is extremely close to the gross domestic product overall, and here for the United States as well. So the less variation in the black line is followed very closely by, again, very small variation in the gross domestic product change. But when you compare it with the investments, we see these sharp ups and downs in the growth rate of investments that is probably contributing more and more into the change in the gross domestic product. The same applies not only to the UK, but United States. You see sharper increases and decreases in investment series than the consumption. And the evidence that we see here for developed nations is less evident in the middle-income countries, perhaps because the households there are less able to borrow in order to maintain their consumption in the face of shocks to their income. So the point here is that the consumption also shows a large variation in low-income, middle-income countries. So here you see again investments showing sharp jumps in Mexico as opposed to consumption and overall economic activity. The same applies for South Africa, right? So very sharp changes in the investment series. However, when you look at consumption, it doesn't look like it is acting as smoothly as it does in the developed nations or rich, high-income nations. You can see here consumption showing a huge collapse, huge jump, and some, again, sharper increases and decreases in the Mexican economy, and somewhat, again, sharper increases. So it can go above the peak of the GDP time to time and below the peak of GDP time to time in South Africa as well. So there are larger variations in middle-income nations in comparison to high-income ones. I will continue with the multiplier model in the next video.